I'm Dawn Murray, 34 years old. A daughter, a sister, a woman who once believed family meant unconditional love. You weren't worth showing up for. Those words, spoken not aloud but through their absence, branded me more deeply than any insult. My parents never had to say it. Their silence screamed louder than words. From as early as I can remember, I lived in the long shadow of my older brother, Brent, the golden child. When he won a middle school football game, our backyard filled with neighbors, streamers, and barbecue smoke. Dad clapped him on the back, grinning, "That's my boy." I stood by the picnic table in a new dress, clutching a soda can, waiting for someone, anyone, to notice me. No one did. When I landed the lead role in the school play, I peeked through the curtain, searching for Mom and Dad in the audience. Their seats were empty. They were home helping Brent prepare for a math test. My spotlight felt hollow, my applause meaningless. By 14, the message was clear. My victories didn't matter. I had just won a statewide essay contest and rushed home with a shiny plaque. I imagined it on the fridge, pride shining in their eyes. Instead, Mom glanced at it briefly and said, "That's nice, honey." Then she turned back to planning Brent's graduation banquet. That plaque ended up gathering dust on my dresser, while his trophies gleamed from the living room mantel. The pattern never changed. Birthdays forgotten, debate tournaments skipped. At 16, my own father muttered, "We're busy, Dawn. Brent has college applications. Busy. Always too busy for me." Each dismissal chipped away at me until I stopped asking for their attention. I learned to swallow the ache and pretend I didn't care, but I did care. Every child cares. Every daughter longs for her parents to say, "We see you. You matter." Instead, I was invisible in my own home. Years later, when I put on my wedding dress, I held on to one last fragile hope. Maybe, just maybe they would come. Maybe they would prove me wrong. But the seats reserved for my parents and my brother stayed painfully empty. No call, no message, no excuse. Just silence, heavier than the veil on my shoulders. That absence was my answer. I was never enough for them. And yet, what I didn't know then was that this very rejection would ignite something fierce inside me. Because being ignored doesn't break you, it reshapes you. It carves out a hunger to be seen, to prove you are more than the shadow they pushed you into. My story doesn't end with their silence at my wedding. That was only the beginning. And soon, when success lit up my life in ways they never expected, their silence would turn into something far uglier. Greed. They didn't come to my wedding. They didn't call for years. But the moment they saw a photo of my brand new $210,000 Tesla on Facebook, my phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice was clipped, sharp, almost businesslike. "Dawn, where did you get that money? We need to have a family meeting." For a moment, I just sat there, phone pressed to my ear, staring at the walls of the house Kyle and I had built together. This was the same woman who hadn't even sent me a card on my wedding day. The same parents who had forgotten birthdays, skipped milestones, brushed off every achievement. And now, suddenly, because of a car, I was worth calling. I knew what they wanted, not me, not my happiness, not my love. They wanted the money they thought I had. But before I tell you what happened at that family meeting, you need to know how I got there. How I built a life they could no longer ignore. After high school, I stopped waiting for their approval. I picked up a camera and started filming simple things. Leaves falling in the park, kids laughing at the bus stop, my dog chasing a squeaky toy. With shaky hands and free editing software, I stitched those clips together into short films. It was messy, but it was mine. My first YouTube upload, a 1-minute montage called Small Things, won a local contest. Strangers clapped for me while my parents didn't even bother to show up. That night, as I walked home with the trophy clutched in my hands, I realized something. I could live my entire life waiting for their applause. Or I could build a stage where I didn't need it. So I built it. At university, between shifts at a coffee shop and endless assignments, I poured myself into video creation. Slowly, people started to notice. Comments trickled in. "This feels like home. You have an eye for beauty." Those words from strangers filled the void my parents had left. I kept going, refining my craft, chasing the spark. One professor saw my potential and pushed me harder than anyone ever had. By senior year, I had led a team to win a national digital media competition. The prize money wasn't life-changing, but the belief in my talent was. After graduation, I founded a small company, Spark Vibe Studio. It started in a cramped co-working space with cheap ramen dinners and sleepless nights. I pitched to anyone who would listen, cafes, startups, local shops. Then one day, a sharp-eyed investor named Sylvia Grant leaned over my portfolio and said, "Your work cuts through the noise. Let's make it happen." With her backing, Spark Vibe grew. Local businesses turned into regional clients, regional into national. Soon we were creating viral campaigns that doubled sales and reached millions online. And then came the call that changed everything. A major streaming platform wanted to acquire Spark Vibe. After months of negotiations, I signed the deal. $18 million. $18 million, built from the silence of my family's absence. I remember sitting in our tiny living room with Kyle, hands trembling as I told him. He hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. "You did this," he whispered. "You turned pain into power." That was the moment I bought the Tesla, not to show off, not to flaunt, but as a small symbol that the girl who once ate birthday dinner alone in her room had built a life entirely her own. And yet, that car became the bait that pulled my family back into my orbit. When Mom called demanding a meeting, I knew exactly what awaited me: accusations, expectations, and their sudden rediscovery of family loyalty. What they didn't know was that I had a plan of my own, a move they would never see coming. But before I tell you how that meeting unfolded, let me ask you something. Has your family ever ignored your biggest moments only to reappear when they thought you could give them something? If you felt that sting, you know exactly where my story is heading. Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and if this story resonates, stay with me. The twists ahead are sharper than you can imagine, because the meeting wasn't just about money. It was about reclaiming my voice, my worth, and finally saying the words I had swallowed my entire life. Driving back to Madison felt like driving straight into a storm I had been avoiding my whole life. The streets were familiar, but every corner carried a bruise of memory. Birthdays forgotten, trophies ignored, moments erased. Kyle offered to come, but I told him no. This was my battle. The brick house I grew up in hadn't changed. Same neat lawn, same basketball hoop in the driveway. But as I stepped onto the porch, I felt like a stranger knocking on someone else's door. My father opened it with a stiff smile, as if I were just another visitor. Inside, Mom busied herself with coffee cups, avoiding my eyes. And there was Brent, perfect Brent, scrolling on his phone like nothing in the world had shifted. We sat at the dining table. The same table where I had once begged them to notice me, only to be drowned out by stories of Brent's next achievement. Now, the silence was thick, almost theatrical, as if they were all waiting for their lines. Finally, Mom began, "Dawn, we saw your car. You've done well." Her words hung in the air like bait. I didn't bite. I simply nodded, waiting for the real reason they'd summoned me. Brent cleared his throat, putting on that lawyer's tone he'd perfected. "Ella and Mason's tuition is crushing us," he said. "And the mortgage, well, I'm underwater." "You've built a fortune, Dawn. You could help." Just a small piece for family, Dad chimed in. "Family steps up. That's how it works." For a moment, I said nothing. My pulse pounded in my ears, but I kept my voice steady. "Where were you when I walked down the aisle?" Mom's eyes flickered. "We were busy, Dawn. You know how Brent's case was?" I cut her off. "Busy. Always busy. Busy when I won the essay contest. Busy when I performed on stage. Busy when I turned 16 and waited all day for you to say happy birthday. But suddenly, now that I have money, you find time for me." The room shifted. My father's jaw tightened. Mom stared at the coffee cup in her hands. And then Brent did something unexpected. He leaned back and sighed. You're right. The words stunned me. Brent never admitted I was right, not once in our childhood. They should have been there for you, he said, shooting a glance at our parents. I know I got more attention. I know it wasn't fair. But Dawn, he leaned forward, lowering his voice. Don't punish Ella and Mason for their mistakes. They don't deserve that. Just help with tuition. That's all I'm asking. For the first time, I almost believed him. The brother I had longed for, protective, understanding, was suddenly there, reaching out. A warmth flickered inside me, fragile but real. Maybe this meeting wasn't just about money. Maybe after all these years I could finally matter. But then, the mask slipped. Brent's tone hardened. If you don't step up, Dawn, think about what that says about you, about the kind of person you've become. His words were precise, like blades honed for cross-examination. You flaunt an expensive car, millions in the bank, but you can't help your own blood? Do you know how people will see that? My chest went cold. It wasn't compassion, it was strategy. He had played me, softened me, only to twist the knife. My brother, the one I had once envied for being loved, was now wielding guilt like a weapon. You're being selfish, Dad added, his voice firm, echoing Brent's accusation. Family means sacrifice. I stood slowly, the chair scraping against the hardwood. My hands trembled, but not from fear, from fury finally unchained. Selfish, I spat. I built everything without you. I clawed my way up while you polished Brent's trophies. I sold a company for $18 million while you couldn't be bothered to send me a card on my wedding day. And now you dare call me selfish? The air cracked with tension. Mom's eyes brimmed with tears, but whether they were from guilt or manipulation, I couldn't tell. Brent's expression hardened into something uglier than arrogance. It was entitlement. He hadn't come to reconcile. He had come to collect. And in that moment, I saw the truth. Their sudden concern wasn't about family. It was about access. To me. To my money. To everything they thought I owed them. I leaned over the table, voice steady, sharp as glass. You don't get to ignore me my entire life and then claim me when it's convenient. You don't get to call me invisible and then demand I make you whole. I don't owe you anything. The room went still. Even Brent had no quick retort this time, but inside me, something had shifted. For years I had swallowed my words, begged for scraps of love. Now, finally, I had spoken them aloud. The storm wasn't over. If anything, it had only begun. But for the first time, I wasn't the girl in the corner, unseen. I was the woman at the head of the table, unshakable, and they weren't ready for what I would do next. The silence after my outburst was deafening. Years of swallowed words had finally spilled across the table, and for once my parents had no rehearsed excuse, no quick deflection. Dad's face was stone, Brent's jaw tight with contempt. But then my mother, Joan Murray, the woman whose approval I had chased all my life, looked up. Her eyes shimmered with tears. "Dawn," she whispered, voice trembling. "You're right. We weren't there for you. I should have been. I should have seen you." The apology hit me like a blow. My chest tightened, my throat thickened. For 34 years I had waited to hear those words. She reached across the table, her hand brushing mine. "But it's not too late," she said softly. "We can fix this. We can be a family again." Something inside me ached to believe her. To believe that my mother, after all the birthdays forgotten and milestones ignored, finally saw me, that she could finally love me the way I had begged for as a child. But before that fragile hope could take root, she added, "If you help Brent with the tuition, if you take some of this burden off us, it could bring us together again. Don't throw this family away, Dawn. Not when you finally have the power to hold us." Her words twisted like a knife. The apology wasn't for me. It was for the money. Even her tenderness was transactional. The second betrayal. I pulled my hand back slowly. The room blurred for a moment, my vision swimming. This was my mother, the woman who should have shielded me, defended me, loved me. Instead, she was bargaining with my ache, leveraging my deepest wound for tuition bills and mortgages. Brent leaned in, emboldened by her plea. "See, Dawn? We're all on the same side here. Don't make this harder than it has to be." The mask was gone now. Whatever flicker of reconciliation I thought I saw in my mother's eyes had vanished, replaced by calculation. They weren't here to heal. They were here to cash in. I steadied my voice, though it quivered at the edges. "You think family can be bought with tuition checks? You think you can erase decades of absence with an invoice?" Dad slammed his palm on the table. "Enough. This is what happens when people get money. They forget where they came from." I laughed bitterly. Forget where I came from? I could never forget. Every empty seat at every milestone etched it into me. I built my life without you. I built it in spite of you, Mom's tears spilled, but I could see now they weren't born of regret. They were born of fear. Fear that the golden child she had worshipped was drowning, and the daughter she had ignored was her only lifeline. I stood, pulling a folder from my bag. My heart pounded as I laid it on the table. Their eyes followed it, confusion flickering into anticipation. "You think I've been sitting on $18 million for myself?" I said, my voice firm. "You think I came here to decide how much of my success you get?" I slid the folder across. Inside was a press release already sent to local news outlets. My parents' hands trembled as they flipped through the papers. "$15 million, Mom whispered, her voice breaking. $15 million donated to a children's education charity," I said. "Scholarships for kids who never had a chance. For kids who grew up invisible, just like me." The room erupted. Dad's face turned red. "You're throwing it away," he barked. Brent slammed the table. "That money could have set Ella and Mason up for life." I met his gaze, unflinching. "You set them up. Not me. I'm not here to bail you out. I'm here to give children what I never had. Support, belief, a chance." Mom's voice cracked. "We're your family, Dawn. Don't you see? We're all we've got." I looked at her, the woman I had once begged to notice me. "No," I said quietly. "Family is the people who show up, and you never did." The words sliced through the room. The three of them sat in stunned silence, as though the ground had been ripped from beneath their feet. For once, I wasn't the invisible daughter. I was the one holding the truth, unshakable and clear. I gathered my folder, tucking it back into my bag. My hands no longer trembled. As I walked toward the door, Mom called after me. Her voice cracked, breaking into sobs. "Dawn, wait, we're sorry. Please, we didn't know how much we hurt you." I paused with my hand on the doorknob. My back to them, I whispered, "You knew. You just didn't care." And then I walked out. The air outside was cold and sharp, but it filled my lungs with a freedom I had never known. The weight of years slid off my shoulders as I stepped into the driveway, leaving behind the ghosts of the house that had never been a home. The second betrayal had gutted me, yes. But it had also carved a new clarity. I didn't need their approval, their apologies, or their love. I had outgrown the need for them, and what I had built, the life, the love, the purpose, was worth more than their belated tears. The door closed behind me with a finality I had never felt before. For 34 years, that house had been a prison of silence and neglect. Walking away felt like unlocking chains that had bound me since childhood. But freedom doesn't come without aftermath. Word of the $15 million donation spread quickly. Local news outlets picked it up. Strangers online praised me, called me inspiring. My phone buzzed with messages from people who had never met me, but somehow understood me better than my own parents. For the first time, I wasn't invisible. I was a story, a symbol of turning pain into purpose. Back in Madison, though, the fallout was brutal. Through mutual acquaintances, I heard that Brent's finances unraveled faster than he admitted. The mortgage he had complained about during our meeting finally collapsed. The bank foreclosed, and Brent, the golden child who once had banquets thrown in his honor, was forced to move into a modest apartment with his wife and kids. His pride, the mantle of success our parents had polished for decades, shattered overnight. My parents fared no better. Dad had been counting on early retirement, maybe even leaning on the fantasy that I would take care of them the way they had never taken care of me. Instead, with their debts mounting, they were forced to pick up side jobs. Mom working evenings at the same law firm where she had spent years as an assistant, Dad taking contract work long after his peers had settled into retirement. I should have felt vindicated, and part of me did. But another part, the part that still remembered sitting alone on my 16th birthday waiting for someone to notice me, felt a pang of sorrow. Not sympathy, just the ache of knowing things could have been different, if only they had chosen to love me when it mattered. Kyle saw the turmoil in me. One evening, as we sat on the porch of our small house, he handed me a mug of coffee and said quietly, "You don't have to carry their choices anymore. You've done enough, more than enough." His words settled into me like a balm. For years, I had believed their neglect defined me, but sitting there with him, surrounded by the warmth of his family who checked in, who celebrated small victories, who showed up, I realized I had found what family truly meant. Blood had failed me, but love had saved me. Life began to take on a new rhythm. I didn't start another company right away. Instead, I devoted myself to the education foundation I had funded. I volunteered, mentored kids who reminded me of my younger self, overlooked, underestimated, waiting for someone to believe in them. One girl, Mia, shy but full of sparks, wanted to be a filmmaker. I spent weekends teaching her editing techniques, watching her eyes light up as she pieced together her first story. "You're amazing, Dawn," she whispered once, hugging me. Those 3 words pierced deeper than any apology my parents could ever offer. The work gave me a sense of wholeness my family never had. Every thank you, every smile from a child who finally felt seen, rebuilt pieces of me that had been broken long ago. I wasn't chasing validation anymore, I was giving it freely, and in return, I was healing. Of course, ghosts still lingered. Sometimes, late at night, I wondered if Mom truly regretted her words, or if Dad ever replayed that slammed door in his mind. I wondered if Brent looked at his children and recognized the weight of repeating the same cycle of favoritism, but I didn't dwell. Their choices belonged to them. Mine belonged to me. As Kyle and I planned for our future, maybe travel, maybe children of our own, I carried with me a clarity sharper than ever. I was no longer defined by absence, but by presence, by the people who showed up, by the love that grew when I stopped begging for scraps. Leaving that house, exposing their betrayal, wasn't just a break, it was a rebirth. And though the scars would always remain, they no longer burned. They were reminders, yes, but not chains. Proof that I had survived, grown, and built a life where I would never again be invisible. Sometimes I still drive past the old brick house in Madison. The lawn looks the same, the basketball hoop still leans over the driveway, but I don't slow down, I don't stop. That house isn't home, it never was. Home, I've learned, is not defined by walls or bloodlines, it's defined by presence, by people who show up when it matters, who hold your hand when you stumble, who cheer when you rise. For me, that's Kyle, that's his family. That's the children I mentor, the ones who remind me of the girl I used to be, hungry to be seen, desperate to be loved. My parents' betrayal and Brent's once felt like scars I'd never escape, but now I see them as lessons. They taught me that neglect can either cage you or fuel you, that rejection can either break you or carve out space for something greater. I chose greater. I chose to take what was meant to diminish me and turn it into a force that could uplift others. And here's the truth. Your worth is not measured by who fails to see you. Your worth is measured by what you choose to do with your life, by the love you give and the love you accept. So if you've ever felt invisible, if your family overlooked you, dismissed you, or showed up only when it benefited them, know this: you are not defined by their blindness. You are defined by your light. I built a company. I donated millions. I found love. But more than that, I found peace in finally understanding that family isn't always blood. Sometimes, family is chosen. And now I want to ask you, have you ever been ignored by those who should have loved you most? Have you ever turned that pain into strength? Share your story in the comments. I read them all because stories like ours deserve to be heard. If mine resonated with you, stay with me. There are more stories to tell, more lessons to share, and together maybe we can remind each other of this simple truth. Rejection is not the end. Sometimes it's the beginning of the life you were meant to live. Thank you for listening, for seeing me. And remember, you are never invisible here.